Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Monday, February 13th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 201 days, the game against Michigan in 285 days. It is time to talk about one of my favorite weekly-ish features at BuckeyeHuddle.com. It is what I know, what I think, what I wonder. It is the musings of the late, great, well, he's not late. Well, he was on time today. He's also not dead. He's Tony Gerdeman of BuckeyeHuddle.com. Sorry, Tony, they rhyme. I don't know what to tell you. Tony wrote about a whole bunch of very interesting different topics in this column in just a couple days ago at BuckeyeHuddle.com, and brought him in to talk about some of those, because one of them, Tony, was C.J. Hicks and the role that C.J. Hicks could have on the team this year, because C.J. Hicks came in last year, 5-star linebacker, true freshman, and then didn't play a snap on defense. And that was one of those things that you mentioned on, I think, a Buckeye Weekly show last week that was like, that can't possibly be right. And then it turned out it was right. But you had a very interesting idea about a spot where, with both linebackers returning, there's obviously not going to be a ton of time available at linebacker, but you had an interesting idea about another spot that he might be able to play on the defense. Yeah,
and let me just first say that I am very anti people saying, this guy should play, that guy needs to play, why isn't this guy playing? I think we don't get to see film, so you don't necessarily know who is playing well and who isn't. And when you say this guy needs to be playing, the assumption is that they have been playing well enough in practice to play. So with that out there, I really think C.J. Hicks needs to be playing this year, Tom. And I think a position to me that seems to make some sense would be that jack position. And call it the stand-up end if you want. Call it the hybrid defensive end linebacker type of thing. It's what we saw Jack Sawyer doing last year, where he would stand up and step in between a couple of tackles, defensive tackles, and then kind of almost just blitz from there, be it a run blitz, be it whatever. Just get in there and disrupt things. And to me, that seems like a good way to get C.J. Hicks on the field. Now, he's not the biggest guy. He's like 6'2", 225. However, in 2021, that's about the size of a freshman that Oklahoma State had doing it. Jim Knowles had doing it. Colin Oliver, I believe, is his name. And, 6'2", 225 as a freshman defensive end, also doing that stand-up jack position, getting into the backfield, posting, 10 sacks, 15 tackles for loss, really having an impact. And I think that's an opportunity for C.J. Hicks, because I don't think you're going to be taking Steel Chambers off the field too much. I don't think you're going to be taking Tommy Eichenberg off the field too much. This would be an opportunity to get C.J. Hicks on the field and also keep Jack Sawyer at defensive end. And it's a nice idea, except when I asked Jim Knowles about the possibility of the jack coming from the linebacker room, he said he didn't really see that happening. So I don't know where the disconnect is, if it's on me or if it's on him.
Yeah, impossible to say who has a better grasp on this year's Ohio State defense. There's no way to know without being in practice, so that will remain a mystery. It is interesting to look at Hicks's potential path to the field, because it's a little bit like, we talked about Sonny Styles in this context last week on a Buckeye Weekly show. It reminds me a little bit of Paris Johnson, where it's you've got these sort of 5-star talent, and that's probably this is probably not going to be a 5-year player for you, and it might not be a 4-year player for you, depending on how the career pans out, and with the measurables and all that comes with being a 5-star player, that tends to align pretty neatly with the measurables that are going to get you drafted reasonably high, whether that is 3 or 4 years later. So it reminds me a little bit of Paris Johnson, where Paris Johnson, there was not really a spot for Paris Johnson as a true freshman, and he just he slotted in where he could slot in. He ended up on the field in some of the playoff games that year after some injuries. And then his sophomore year, he came in, he was a tackle prospect, he was a tackle all the way, but it was like, well, we have to get this guy on the field somewhere. He's, the best, one of our best players. And so then he's playing guard his sophomore year. And that's not where he's ultimately going to end up, but the talent is there. The opportunity is there. You're filling a role, but also you're getting on the field. You're starting to make use of the talent that you've brought in. It feels like that could be a Sonny Styles conversation this year. That could be a C.J. Hicks conversation this year as well.
And as you said, if he comes off the bench this year, and he's going to come off the bench, I don't see anywhere he's starting, because even the jack as they used it last year. I don't know, was it maybe 30-40% of the time? So this is still a smallish role, and he would, in my world, he would be sharing it with others. But then he's probably starting at will linebacker in 2024. If he does really well, then he's off to the NFL, and you've gotten 1 year of starting and 1 year out of significant play out of CJ Hicks. And this is a guy that a can't miss prospect, 5-star, one of the top linebackers in the nation. And if you wait until year 3 to really see what he can do, then I think you've missed some opportunities. And Jim Knowles talks about finding roles for guys and then giving them opportunities to make plays. And the way people talk about CJ Hicks, being this extremely athletic guy. Remember, in high school, he played everywhere defensively. He's played cornerback early in his career to safety to then, linebacker as a senior, but also as a rush end, just go get the quarterback type of guy, where Ryan Shazier did that, I think, his junior, senior year in Florida, where it's just like, nobody can stop you. So let's just cut out the middle, man. Just go get the quarterback, and then we'll get the ball back. And that's a little bit of what CJ Hicks did. And so he has all this different skill set. So if you can't find a good way to use him, I may have written this, or we may have talked about this on Buckeye Weekly in the past. If you can't find a way to use him, I don't think you're looking hard enough.
And the guy who's going to be coaching CJ Hicks at linebacker this year is James Laurinaitis. Laurinaitis, of course, the former Ohio State linebacker, 2-time captain, 3-time All-American, former Notre Dame linebacker coach, and now comes to Columbus this year. He is not, at the moment, one of the 10 on-field assistants, which limits what he can do in terms of recruiting. And you had a very interesting point there about his, path to, climbing the ladder at Ohio State. And that, Brian Hartline is the name that everyone just always sort of throws out there as, is he going to be the next Brian Hartline in terms of former Ohio State player from the Jim Tressel era and, very popular and probably going to be pretty dynamic as a recruiter and all of that. But you said in some ways, maybe Keenan Bailey is a little better model for the start of James Laurinaitis' Ohio State career and what he could be. Share your thoughts there. I thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, and with Keenan Bailey being a grad assistant and advisor and all of these different roles he's had in his time before he was finally the tight ends coach this year, you would hear recruits talk about him and the solid recruiting job that he did, never actually being able to leave campus to do it, always recruiting from campus, whether that's phone calls, that's text, that's on-site visits, campus visits. He would knock it out of the park in that role. A little handicapped, but was still able to succeed in what he was allowed to, in the world he was allowed to play in. And so that's kind of where James Laurinaitis is right now, and it's where he was at Notre Dame, where a lot of the top linebackers in the nation interacted with him, really enjoyed those interactions, but it was always via phone or computer or on campus in South Bend. And that's where he is now, doing it at Ohio State because he can't travel. So it's all, he's still able to recruit, but not able to go out on the road. And so it's exactly what Keenan Bailey was doing. So what kind of impact can he make as a recruiter? He's already making an impact in terms of the guys are interested. Now you have to, it's a different thing from interest to signing them, as we know, but that's where he is right now. And it's going to be where he is until he's actually on the road and able to go and visit and do things like that as one of the 10 assistant coaches. And I also think, remember, this is a guy who played forever under Luke Fickell, one of the most patient coaches in Ohio State football history, Luke Fickell, to stick around for as long as he did before finally leaving for Cincinnati. So James Laurinaitis also learned patience from Luke Fickell. And so even if it doesn't happen right away, I think Laurinaitis understands what will eventually happen and then what can eventually happen if you're just a little bit patient.
Yeah, and he's someone who, just based on his relationships from his time at Notre Dame, some of those have sort of ported over to Ohio State now. We've talked to Mark Givler about one point about a linebacker out of Texas who Laurinaitis had a pretty good relationship with at Notre Dame, who is now suddenly interested in Ohio State. And that tells you, well, there might be a little bit of a James Laurinaitis connection there, and that may be the common thread there. And again, that's just building relationships, and that's all, under the same recruiting rules he's going to be operating under here at Ohio State, at least for the time being. So yeah, that is definitely something to watch. Keenan Bailey, one thing that Laurinaitis has in common with Keenan Bailey is they both have pretty good personalities, pretty good senses of humor. You mentioned in your thing, when Keenan Bailey came out during the coach interviews, there were different tables set up, and Brian Hartline was set up at one table, and there were like 15, 20 people standing around Brian Hartline, and I was one of 3 or 4 standing around Keenan Bailey, and Keenan said, he looked at the number of people around Hartline's table and said, you like how we gave Hartline front and center, and he said, I feel like I'm the less desirable house at trick-or-treating that Hartline gives out money or something. So yes, he is the one giving out toothbrushes apparently, and Hartline's giving out the full-size candy bars next door. But his, a good sort of self-deprecating sense of humor, and you can tell why people connect with him, and you kind of get the same vibe out of James Laurinaitis. We have talked about this at times in the past, but Keenan Bailey, in addition to the personality, also has kind of cross-trained in a way that most coaches haven't at Ohio State. He comes into that tight ends coaching room having coached just about everywhere else on the offense over the years, and that feels like that's probably going to be useful for him as he's kind of coaching what is essentially a hybrid position between the wide receivers and the offensive line.
Yeah, he began his career coaching running backs with Tony Alford, and then moved to receivers, and then did some time at quarterback. And then Ryan Day said this when we talked to him last week or 2 ago, that he moved Keenan Bailey to the offensive line last year. And so that in working with the offensive line, he's also working with the tight ends as well. So he's run the entire gamut of the offense, every single position. And now to be at this tight end position where it's as much wide receiver as it is offensive line, as Justin Fry likes to talk about, the offensive line coach. On one play, they're going to ask you to pass block the team's best defensive end. And on the next play, they're going to ask you to get open against the team's best corner. And that's a unique skill set. It's almost a unicorn-like skill set. And so it's a difficult ask, but now Keenan Bailey has had this experience with all of these positions to best enable the Buckeyes to get it done.
So they're just a little taste of sort of a little bit of bouncing around to a bunch of different topics kind of in a short period of time. But Tony does that just about every week at that column. And it is one of the more popular features on our site because there's always some stuff in there that's like, oh, I hadn't really thought about that, or hadn't really thought about that in that way. And so kind of an interesting look at some different, from little different perspectives on the Ohio State football program, I guess, let's say. So that you can find that at the huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com, along with a bunch of other great content there from our fantastic team of insiders. You can also find us on YouTube at youtube.com/BuckeyeHuddle. And if you prefer listening to podcasts, if you're watching this on YouTube and you didn't realize we had podcasts, well, we do these as podcasts as well. You can just search Buckeye Huddle on your podcast platform of choice. Tony and I do the Buckeye Weekly podcast. We do Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning, but we have a whole range of podcasts. You can subscribe to all of those on wherever you listen to podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and review as well, which will help other folks find those shows, which we do genuinely appreciate. And again, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to that channel. Hit that bell as well so you get notified when we do live shows or post something new. That way you never miss a thing. That will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.